Great. Appreciate everyone's patience on that. I should emphasize at the front end, this is a recorded webinar. We will post the recording as well as the PowerPoint presentation on our website shortly following today's training. The focus of today is this is the second training that we are providing for those CTCs that are interested in participating in next year's Innovative Service Development Grant Program, or ISD is our acronym. We're going to talk a little bit about the legislative session and the impacts that has on the application process. Every time we do these sessions, we want to emphasize that everything in here is contingent on the legislature's authority and that they put in the Appropriations Act. So as this session is occurring right now, we are monitoring the budget, and we will talk a little bit about that in a minute. Obviously, the final decision will not know until around May, when it is actually finalized. After we talk a little bit about that, we're going to look into the performance expectations of this grant. We're going to go a little bit deeper into the understanding about what is innovative and try to provide some clarity on that expectation. Then we're going to go into a little bit more into the evaluation process that we use at the commission level after the applications are submitted. We have a subcommittee that has the final, really the recommendations that they give to the commission on the final decision of awarding the project's funding. So we'll go in a little bit about that. And then at the end, we're going to have opportunity for those participating to provide us with feedback, ask questions, and we'll do the best we can to answer that. If we can't answer that today, we will try to get back with you individually, and we'll of course post that information on the website, any kind of question answers, so that everyone else can see that. With that, we'll move into the next slide with the kind of going through the rules of today's webinar. As I mentioned, this is for the CTCs, particularly focusing on the ISD grant projects. We're very appreciative of Thomas Howell Ferguson to assist us. They will be both helping us with this discussion, as well as when we have the conversation with the subcommittee, they will help us with the analysis of the data of relative to these projects. This again is being recorded, and we will post all the information on the website shortly following. We've muted all the audio and phone lines. At one point, we will unmute lines, or we'll ask you to unmute your line if you want to speak. But in the meantime, please take advantage of the chat box features on the webinar. If you have a question, indicate it. The Thomas Howell team will look at that and then make note of it and let you know when you can unmute your line. Again, we're only responding to feedback today on the ISD grant. No other. Commissioners, if there's any commissioners on the line, I did see Commissioner Tellez. Thank you for joining us. Commissioner Tellez is the chair of the subcommittee. If there's any other commissioners or advisors, we ask that you please not communicate privately with each other on the chat box, because even though this is not a formal commission meeting, there's no votes being taken, we still want to make sure that this is operating within the sunshine. So please keep all communication within the public realm of the chat box. Next slide, please. So let's get into the legislative update. As you know, we are in the middle of the Florida legislative session, which occurs for 60 days. It started in the beginning of March. We are at a little over the midpoint at this point, and it is scheduled to end May 5th. So next slide, we'll go into how specifically the session is impacting this program. So let's start with the good news. So just to recap, the governor's recommended budget this year has the ISD grant at $6 million. That is $2 million in addition to what we had funded in the previous, or the current fiscal year, I should say. This current year, we had $4 million that we awarded. So we're hoping, if all goes according to plan, we'll have an additional 2 million for new projects as well. So the good news is the House and Senate have presented their initial budgets. It still has a long way to go through the process, but in essence, the initial, they did pick up the 6 million on both House and Senate side. Now, again, that is just initial. That could change. That has happened in the past, and we've seen that. So, don't say that it is all determined and finalized as far as the amount goes, but for the time being, that is something that we're pleased to inform you all about. However, where it gets tricky is the proviso, that is the language in essence like statute that gives us the direct authority in how to use the funding in the budget. The proviso in the House and Senate is different from what was in the governor's recs. So in essence, our application process, because of the timing this year, we designed our process around the governor's recs, particularly as it related to the caps of projects. So how much a project, the maximum amount that can be awarded. In the governor's recs, it was 500,000 for a single service area and 1 million for a multi service area, meaning a regional project. But the House and Senate have gone with proviso that was in the previous year's budget, where a single county is capped at 750,000 and a multi-county or multi-service area for our purposes is 1.5 million. So that actually raises those ceilings, which for some of your projects that might be good news if you were wanting to pursue more funding. The bad news is that can perchance limit some of the other projects that could get funded. Just kind of weighing the pros and cons of that. And then another piece of the proviso that is unique in the House and Senate is that it is limiting a grant award to one service area. This is something that we're working with the House and Senate. We're hoping that that can be changed, but that, of course, is in their court at this point as to what they decide. The issue, we'd like to encourage more of our systems to submit several projects in separate applications, because it allows us to have a more definitive way of evaluating those projects. But at this point, it is up to the legislature to decide what they want to pursue there. So that's just something to keep in mind. The session is, like I said, scheduled to end on May 5th. So we've got at least 3 or 4 weeks to watch this process play out. And the budget at this point, once it goes through the House and Senate respectively, and I believe that is this week, the next phase will be the budget conferencing. That is a negotiating process that goes on between the House and Senate. And if usually, based on the timing, we usually find out when the final budget what it will look like by the final week of session, which is May 1st. So we're going to continue to keep everyone up to speed on that and that process, and adjust our application once the final budget is presented. Next slide. So what this means for those who are applying, we have adjusted our deadline. We did postpone the April 14th deadline. So good news for all of you like me who are natural procrastinators. You get more time to be able to work on your proposal. We put the deadline for May 12th. That is a Friday, the week after session. So if all goes hopefully according to plan, the legislature will have a final budget by the final week of session, and we will adjust our application caps if needed, or any other requirements if there is any changes, and notify everyone in hopefully sufficient amount of time to adjust your proposals if needed by that deadline. So, and of course, if something changes again, if something else is occurring that we unforeseen, God forbid, they don't pass the budget, then we would have to, of course, adjust according there. But for the sake of today, we're looking at May 12th. Again, we may have to adjust some of the requirements as far as the caps. We still encourage applicants to submit multiple proposals. However, there is no guarantee that they will get an award beyond one, or actually no guarantee they'll get any award, but if the proviso stands as it is presented, commission will not be allowed to award more than one project per service area. The rest of the application expectations should remain the same. The ISD grant goals are the same. The expectation of putting the evidence of need, we're still encouraging the use of non-traditional providers if that is it is an option, but it is something strongly encouraged. So all those expectations will remain the same. And for those of you who need a refresh on that, please visit our website to the previous webinar we did during February that is out there. You can be able to go through those expectations more detailed there. Next slide. So let's get in now to the performance side of this this presentation. We're going to really focus at a high level at the beginning here. Let's move to the next slide. Really want to emphasize the importance of innovative. Yes, we have goals in the expectation, the 3 goals that we talk about: increasing access, providing regional mobility, and reducing barriers to accessing a fixed route. And those are very important. But the title of the grant is innovative, and that means it has to be something new presented that is unique to your service area. Not necessarily have to be like, for example, if a system in North Florida is testing using TNC services that they've been doing for a while, and somewhere in the south part of Florida wants to replicate that model, even though that model might be implemented at the north side of the state, it would be considered new in the sense of the south part of the state. So that's just a very high level example. But it's important to see here, this slide shows the definition of innovate. Both Google and ChatGPT define it with the word new, that it has to be something new that has not been tested in that particular area. So what do we mean by that? The next slide. How does that impact directly our services? Well, we have that based on our trip and equipment grant, which is the primary vehicle for which we fund transportation disadvantaged services throughout the entire state. So in this sense, the innovative grant is trying to provide something new that is unique to what is not being offered or able to be offered under the trip and equipment grant. So that is why we emphasize very heavily and throughout our application that these dollars, the ISD grant, are not meant to be supplementing services that are already provided with the trip and equipment grant, because that in essence would just say you're just increasing what you already provide. It needs to go beyond that. It needs to provide something unique that is not offered or not available in your service area. So next slide, I'll give you a visual illustration of how that would look. Let's run a hypothetical situation with the ISD grant into 2 scenarios here. Let's say that this is a project that's proposing to increase service hours available excuse me, in your service area. So in this case, in this scenario, let's say that the trip and equipment grant provides TD services from 6 a.m. to, I believe that is about 9 p.m. You can see in the left-hand side, the gray represents the trip and equipment grant and the orange represents the ISD grant. On the left-hand side, you don't really see very much difference between these 2 services. They're pretty much providing the same level of coverage in the context of hours of the day. Whereas on the right-hand side, you see the orange covers the whole time, so that's 24/7. Now, we're not necessarily saying that you have to do 24 hours. This is just to visualize how you see a service that is not offered or not available under the gray, the trip and equipment grant, and where the orange covers all parts of the day. Even the middle parts of the day, you can still see that there is coverage across the board. So that is just a visual illustration of what we mean by when we're trying to analyze, evaluate a project and whether it's worth funding and it's new. This is an example of where it's visually illustrated. Casey or Jeff, was there anything else to add as far as this illustration goes on the data side?
I think you got it covered, David.
Thank you. Okay, next slide. So moving into more detail, how does this innovation, what is, the importance of it is not simply that you're just also providing something new, but that it's specifically adding value from the customer perspective. We've used this quote throughout our presentations that it is important to consider the needs of the customer when you're designing these proposals. So start with the customer's perspective. Next slide. So what is the added value from the customer perspective? Let's go back to the analogy we used in the last visual illustration. In that case, the added value was that a customer had access 24/7 that previously wasn't available to them under that particular project. So as you're thinking about it, thinking about the perspective of the customer, then work backwards to the transportation side. What is your obstacles to providing that particular service? Is it the funding? Obviously, that's a big issue for a lot of our systems. It might be you're needing a specialized training, like let's say you want to focus on a specific population, you might need additional resources and training for that. What are the obstacles that you can think of to providing this particular project innovative service? So addressing those when you're addressing those in the proposal, consider how the data supports your argument. Data is simply just a way in which you can tell a story, and to help illustrate that, like we showed in the visual, consider how the data can support your claims that there is a need for this service and that this funding would help address that. Okay, next slide. We like to say, as was emphasized during the Reagan administration, during the negotiations with the Soviet Union, that it was an important thing about trust but verify. Your claims in a proposal can be something that can move us, but if the information doesn't support it, it's very difficult for us to see the value of moving forward with that project. So it's important that your information, evidence presented, is supportive of the claims you make. Do not make claims that can be potentially invalidated by the data. So if your claim, for example, that you can't provide these services don't exist, but your data shows that it does, that is going to make it really unlikely that that project will get approved by the commission. So again, thinking of innovating as new, what is something that's new, and then considering what variables in your data that you can present both in your project as well as what's existing in your trip and equipment grant that can validate those claims. And I'll give an example of that later on in this presentation of how that could potentially look. Next slide. We, again, very much appreciate the CTCs that have submitted early bird applications. That really helps us. It helps you all for us to give you feedback, but it helps us to see where there's some common areas that are needing improvement.
That was a video.
So some of the takeaways that we got from the early birds was that for the projects, excuse me, I have to take a moment here. Hold on. For the projects that are reapplying for funding for a second year, we strongly encourage that your application be up to date. So look at what you have currently provided or the process you've gone through to set things up in your delivering these services under the existing grant, ISD grant. Make sure that your proposal reflects the progress that has been made. So in essence, what that means is take what all of you who have presented to the commission back in March in your presentations during those workshops. Those were very illuminating presentations. We felt those helped us understand not only the benefits that you've been able to provide with those services, but also the challenges you're having. Those proposals that you're submitting need to reflect that information as well. Even though we have those presentations, available to us, we still want to make sure that those proposals also reflect that same information. Okay, so also when you're looking at your proposal, many of you might, and I get it because I also do the same, you want to recycle what you've already presented to us. Why reinvent the wheel? There's nothing wrong with recycling some of the claims that you make, but make sure that they're up to date. So if you're using trip estimates, eligibility, budget, those are things you need to really consider. Are those going to be different for the next year? And if so, please explain if you've changed your estimates or if you're changing your budget, why is that the case? Is it, is there a reason for that that is adjusting for the next year? Beyond just the applications for reapplying, broader sense of all applications, we do want to emphasize, please try to be concise and clear when you're stating your project. There were some that we read that were very complicated, difficult to understand what was the point of it. We understand there's a lot of information that you're trying to condense and explain. But if we can't walk away with a clear understanding about what that project is, it's going to be harder for the commission to stand behind it and awarding that. So just that's a very common sense kind of consideration. Think about your audience. The subcommittee members are not necessarily experts on the details of every single thing that you're doing. So try to explain it as a layman's perspective as best you can. When you're looking at paratransit services, we understand that many of your systems are providing a variety of services like ADA complementary paratransit. And when you're looking at that perspective, please keep in mind that this funding is intended only to be used for the TD eligible population. So that's not to necessarily say that the insights gained on the project could be beneficial for your general paratransit services, but as far as the funding eligibility goes, these are intended for TD eligible individuals. So make sure that that is emphasized in your proposal. That was something that has come up frequently in the past as an issue that we've had to address. Other things to keep in mind is to make sure that you cite the sources of claims that you make, making sure that it's, the reference points are clearly stated. And then obviously good common practices to try to get your proposals done in sufficient amount of time where you can have a chance to review it, reread it, and make adjustments as needed, checking for spelling errors, etc. That's kind of a summary of the early birds that we got, some important key takeaways. Sherry or team, was there anything else that I missed or that's important as far as good tips for putting presentation or putting proposals together?
Hey, David, this is Sherry. One thing that I wanted to touch on, I was gonna say this later as a reminder, but we'll go for it here too. When you're demonstrating how you're arriving at the amount of funding that you're requesting, don't confuse this with your project expense budget. You have to show us how and why you're requesting what you're requesting, but there's also an expense budget that has to be submitted along with that. So just that was one thing that we had a little bit of discussion about. Also, when you're doing the expense budget, if your only expense is going to be purchased transportation, like you're contracting everything out, and you want the funding to go mainly for the service, you need to justify or explain how your other expenses associated with the project are going to be covered, because it just doesn't, we need to understand that aspect of it as well. I think that was it, in addition to what you said for me.
Yeah, thank you, Sherry. I did forget about that one. I'm glad you brought it up. Plus, you gave me a chance to recover my voice. All right, great. And next slide, please. All right, now we're going to go into the evaluation process that we use with the subcommittee. So taking a lot of the things we just talked about, we're going to try to give you some scenarios of what it looks like from our point of view as reviewers and from the staff point of view, how we have to do our job of briefing the subcommittee members based on the analysis we do of each of these projects. So next slide. So this is the general gist of what happens. The application deadline, which is now just again May 12th, is our now new deadline. After that date, we will, as a staff, review each project and analyze the data that we have. That is the data both that is presented with the ISD grant as well as the trip and equipment grant. And then we will provide those proposals as well to the subcommittee members. Our subcommittee consists of Commissioner Tellez as the chair, and then 3 agency advisors from Florida Department of Transportation, Agency for Persons with Disabilities, and Department of Elder Affairs. Each of these subcommittee members use the evaluation rubric that is provided within the application packet to review and rank the proposals. When I talk about rank, I don't necessarily mean ranking them in a quantitative sense exactly on a score side. It's more ranking that there are projects that we might say when we look at them as a whole, these are the projects that we feel are really strong, that you can categorize or tier as strong proposals. Then you have projects that we might like in concept and feel that they're worthy of being awarded, but there's some challenges with aspects of the project, and I'll get into that in a minute. But especially when you're looking at there's a finite amount of funding available, sometimes we can't award all the projects what they're requesting just because of the limitations of funding availability. So that's a consideration. And then third, there are going to be projects that we just feel should not be awarded based on, for various reasons. It could just be like we talked about, that it appears duplicative or supplementing of what is existing in the service area, or doesn't necessarily fit the criteria that is of the grant program. So when this year we're going to present the projects in the order of first, the projects that are reapplying being considered first in the discussion, and then we will follow that with the new projects. That doesn't mean that all the projects that are reapplying are going to get awarded. It means simply that we're going to give them first consideration in the evaluation process, followed by the new projects and seeing how those measure up as well. So from here on, let's look at some examples, and we're going to use fictitious examples, but they're not very far off, I'd say, from the reality of what we deal with. I think it's something, this is important, I think, from my point of view, at least, to emphasize, because when we look at these projects, a lot of them are very challenging because we might really like the concept. We're dealing with a vulnerable population, we're dealing with tough issues, and we have to weigh those in. But also, we have to remember that we have these criteria for a reason. And so it is a competitive grant. So when you're looking at them all together, it isn't simply black and white, yes or no. You have to consider the varying pros and cons of these projects. So we're going to try to illustrate that here. So first project is focusing, in this scenario, is focusing on elderly senior population. Let's say that the CTC is a council on aging, just for making it up, and that they want to focus on providing the innovation grant dollars to support non-senior center activities. And so in this case, we see that the data supports this claim based on the trip and equipment grant. It shows that the activities that they want to support doesn't appear on the trip and equipment grant invoice. In this case, this is a project that we have funded. We do usually look at how much they've spent in the previous year that we funded it. That's important because, you know, some projects, if they're not spending their dollars, and there could be reasons for that, compared to those that are spending their dollars, that's one indicator of that there is a need or a higher need and demand for these services. So that is a consideration in this particular scenario that is also being weighed when evaluating the project. Okay, next slide. So project 2, again, this is a project that is been funded in the past. This is a case where it was innovative when it was presented. In this case, we're saying this scenario was supporting TNC services that were originally not available in that service area. We funded it for 3 years. This is the scenario that we're going to likely get for some of our projects, by the way. So just keep this in mind that when we're weighing projects, some of them is going to be asked this question: why do we continue to fund it? Because at some point, these are meant to be, in essence, testing something new. When does the testing period end? And it needs to be considered something that either stands on its own or fits in another funding bucket somehow, some way. This is the challenge that we have to grapple with on this grant program. So this scenario gives an example where we see the value of the TNC service in this service area, but the project being proposed for this upcoming year doesn't really seem to demonstrate anything new beyond what has already been funded in the past. Okay, next slide. Project 3 is a new project that's looking at trying to expand cross-county services in a particular region. So given that it's a cross-county partnership between multiple CTCs to do the service, under our eligibility criteria, their cap is higher. So in this case, we're using the 1 million cap. Proposal is asking for that capped amount. And in this case, the data demonstrates that one of them, at least one of the CTCs, has provided some limited services in a cross-county sense. And we had the data here in this case, in this scenario, to show that about $450,000 of the Trip and Equipment grant was going to support those services. So in this scenario, the ISD grant is trying to not only expand for that CTC who's doing it, but partner with another CTC to broaden the access to those out-of-county trips. Okay, and then finally, next slide. Hopefully I can get through this without losing my voice. This is a scenario of a new project that is looking at providing additional trips to dialysis clinics. In this case, they're basically arguing that they want to provide that they're limited based on the Trip and Equipment grant dollars to provide additional access to dialysis appointments. Plus, they're citing concerns that a lot of dialysis patients have to wait or be moved around with other Trip and Equipment grant writers. So in this case, their scenario is that they want to provide additional access, more trips with this funding to access dialysis clinics. Here's the the concern with this type of scenario, and this is something that we have talked about as a concern in the past, and you can apply this to other aspects, but dialysis is a big one because we see this a lot. Simply saying that you're adding value because you're providing more trips from the customer perspective, that might be true, but it's not necessarily a new service. You are still providing those services. You're just sort of switching the funding to extend what is already being provided. That may be something that is worthwhile from a customer perspective, but many of our systems can make those same claims, and that this funding is very limited. It is not expected to be indefinite. And so when you're looking at it, what additionally are you providing beyond just new trips? What is that's novel about this project? Keep in mind that it is competitive. So when you're comparing other projects, this is a project that would not necessarily be on the higher ranking of strength, even though it may have some good qualities. It not necessarily as quite as novel as the other projects that we'd shared in this scenario. Okay, so next slide. We're going to go into, excuse me for 1 second. My apologies. So now we're going to go into the scenario of deliberation by the subcommittee after we brief them on all the projects. Where do we rank them? How do we order the strength of these proposals? So first, let's look at project 1, which was the one that we said was the strongest. And the reasons for this strength was because it demonstrated that there was new services being offered, that it was not replicated under the trip and equipment grant. They demonstrated strong need for the service. They were focusing on a particular segment of the population that would have increased access that otherwise wasn't available to them. So all agree in this particular case that this is the strongest proposal. Okay, next slide. On the project 2, when we're looking at, this is the one that is been the TNC project. We have a deliberation example here where everybody seems to like the project. They see that it's continued to demonstrate good outcomes. The ridership is increasing, and again, maybe there's other applications out there that we have to consider. So, it's based on availability funding, but let's say in this scenario, there is enough funding to maybe support it for 1 more year. However, in this case, we may have to say, let's consider putting a recommendation as a subcommittee that this project be funded. This will be the last year of funding for that project. So that's just a potential example that could occur with some of these projects. So next one. On the project 3, this is one that's new, that's trying to do a regional mobility project that is, in this case, where the trip and equipment grant does show that there are those services available, at least in one portion of the region of coverage, but it's very limited. And so the subcommittee agrees that this is something that is new or newer or adding value. However, because of the budget aspects of our limited funding, $1 million is pretty high. And so based on this scenario, we said, well, maybe the subcommittee agrees that the instead of doing $1 million, let's fund it at 900,000, which would be basically the double the amount of what we funded under the trip and equipment grant for that one system. Okay, next slide. And then this is an example of project 4 as the one that is the weakest of the 4 proposals, where we have the example of the trip and equipment grant demonstrating that all those services are being provided existing, even though their claim is that they're expanding the trips coverage and access to those clinics. It is not necessarily innovative beyond that point. So now I tried to present this as, because this can happen, that you may have subcommittee members that feel really strongly in some ways versus others. So like in this case, I was trying to portray that one of our advisors in this particular scenario really likes this proposal and feels strongly that we should support it. That is the reason why we have a subcommittee, is that you get different perspectives and considerations through that process. Next slide. So in summing this fictitious scenario of ranking, we as a subcommittee agreed that the first project is an example that is very strong and is supported across the board. The second project, being project 3, is an example where it is supported. It's a new project, but maybe the funding needs to be adjusted slightly because of the fact that it's, consideration of all the projects involved. The third ranked is project 2, which is focusing on the TNC services. That the concept is something that was innovative when it was first created, and that we need to start moving towards phasing out that funding in the if it comes back the following year. And then finally, the fourth project is an example that is not recommended based on the fact that it is already being provided under existing funding with the trip and equipment grant. Let me make one last point here on the project 4, compare that to project 1. So project 1 was the example of a focus on seniors getting access to activities that they don't otherwise have. One could argue that project 4 could have looked very different if they had said that dialysis patients may not be able to use trip and equipment dollars to go outside of dialysis appointments because that's the only available funding they can use for, I hope I explained that correctly, but basically if the project was framed in a different way and said, instead of saying we're going to take dialysis trips to dialysis clinics, but rather focus on dialysis patients' access to outside of the dialysis clinic, which is already supported under the trip and equipment grant, that would have potentially a very different outlook and review. So some of these projects can be great concepts, but the way they're articulated and presented makes a huge difference in the way that the subcommittee and the commission will review them. So was there anything from the CTD team or Thomas Howell that I missed? I apologize that I am been losing my voice and trying to juggle here. Trying to explain all these concepts, but was there anything else to add to these points?
David, this is Jeff, not from our perspective.
All right. Well, with that, we'll do one last recap. Next slide. Before we get into the feedback. So the takeaways today, again, application deadline has been moved to May 12th. The ranking process that we use is based on the quality of the proposals and the availability of CTD data. That's going to be very critical in our deliberation. We will, of course, give first recognition to the previous projects as considered for this year. But please, for those of you who are reapplying, make sure your proposals are up to date and reflecting all the relevant information of what you've been able to accomplish thus far. If a proposal makes a claim and the data is contradicting that, it is unlikely it is going to be recommended by the subcommittee. The subcommittee may recommend different amounts depending on what is available in our budget. We don't know how many projects or proposals we will get, so that's something that we can't really make a determination of until we get all of them in play. And then finally, I'd say the biggest takeaway has been that projects have to be something new. So more money, more trips is not necessarily something that is going to be on its own worthy of consideration here. So with that, we'll move into the feedback for this session. And again, if we can't answer the questions, we'll try our best to address those shortly after the webinar. I'll turn it over to Jeff's team to moderate the comments.
David, at this time, there's no indication of questions in the chat. If anybody does have questions regarding the presentation or any of the comments made by David or the FCTD team, just let us know. just type your name in there and we'll call you to unmute and ask your question. Commissioner Tellez did indicate to be sure that there's clarity in what or how the data will be collected. Commissioner Tellez, would you like to expand on that? And can unmute.
Yes. Thank you very much. I think it became very clear to me during our presentations we had from the current grant, and there were quite a few of them that really went out of their way to collect data on how information was collected regarding their I would say their performance, as well as comments from their actual the people who receive the services. So I think those two are very important to plan as you think about putting together your proposal, so that on the back end we don't question, you know, the service that was provided, the value of the service that was provided.
Right.
Thank
So customer satisfaction surveys are an example of that, I believe. But we do many of our projects are doing this year. You know, I think if you have that data, I believe Commissioner Tellez, you're saying that, you know, that would be very important to also address in the application.
Yes, because if you think of the end in mind, you know, you would go ahead and plan that and include that in your, because you're going to be asked for that information anyway if your project is accepted. So that way you already have it in the plans, and it'll be easier instead of trying to pull it out at a later date.
There is an additional question, David, from Heidi. I apologize if I mispronounced Villa. Her question is, would a survey of the partners a CTC plans to use, asking them what they estimate is the number of riders that can be serviced, a sufficient data source. And expanded a data source to calculate the projection of trips that can be serviced within the project. Heidi, if you'd like to unmute to clarify that or ask, you're welcome to do that.
Yeah, Kelly Brooks and I had some collaboration on how we are going to collect and what data to collect. And I remember in a prior training session about the ISD grant, David had mentioned doing a survey would be a good data source, but I just wanted, you know, what we had discussed about to make sure, you know, the ideas that we're kicking around are something that would work. We want to do, obviously, what is going to give good, sufficient numbers. And that's basically where the question's coming from.
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying you're looking at doing a survey of your current ridership to see, like, if our system were able to provide these services under this innovative grant, would you?
Not necessarily are they current riders. It's a partnership with like the Workforce Coalition, basically with like career source and stuff like that, to kind of get some feedback from them of, hey, if we had this program, potentially how many riders do you think would like access it?
Yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. So partnerships, very good question. Partnerships are, of course, something that we encourage in the grant. It isn't a requirement, but if you have identified partners, I think that definitely goes a long way when you can show. To me, that's an example where it's not just you're naming the partner like Career Source, but you actually have additional conversations that were documented as to seeing their support. I think that was there could be many ways you can do that, but one way could be letters of support, identifying potential clients that would benefit from the service that the partners work with. There's many ways you can articulate that. I think it definitely will help a project or a proposal when you have more meat to it than simply just saying we're going to partner with ABC company and then that's the extent. Which sometimes we get those proposals where it's only mentioned and then that's it. Team,
Okay.
is there anything thoughts on y'all's end on that side?
This is Sherry. I just wanted to, I guess, elaborate a little bit more on what you were just saying. So just because I am working with a dialysis center does not make that a true partnership. They need to have a role in the project. So like David was saying, just mentioning somebody or an agency doesn't really truly, they may support your project and they can do a letter of support, but that's not a true partnership. They have to do and work within that project.
Yes, Kelly's already had some meetings and kind of is already working and partnering and discussing like how they're going to basically help coordinate, the potential writers and everything. So I would say that work is already itself being done. They realize that it's not just going to be hey, we're going to have this now and you can have access to it kind of thing. It's going to be more of a back and forth rapport in order to make sure that it is a maximized opportunity, and that they actually really help funnel to make sure that their the potential needs are actually going to get met, not just sit back and say, oh yeah, this is just one more on your list to have access to. I don't think that's exactly what Kelly's shooting for.
Well, that sounds it sounds promising. I like the concept that you're presenting, at least, and the way you're presenting it. It sounds like it's definitely gonna be something that's worth making mention in the proposal when you do submit it.
Awesome. Okay, thank you for your answers. Very helpful.
Are there any other questions? I'm not seeing any at this time. Give everybody another few minute or so to type those in.
So again, while you're thinking about this, we will again post this information on the website shortly after this webinar, and if there's any changes that occur again during the legislative session, we will make adjustments according. Our hope is that we have the final budget by the week of May 1st, and that would give folks about a little less than 2 weeks to adjust if they need to adjust their proposals by the deadline of May 12th.
David, I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
All right. Well, with that, I want to thank everybody again for also enduring the technical challenges we had today. We appreciate everybody's involvement in this project. Appreciate all the subcommittee members for being on the call and of course always taking time out of the busy schedules to review these applications and participate in this process. We will look forward to sharing more information in the coming weeks. With that, I'm and I think on that note, I will go ahead and say goodbye. Thanks everybody for participating.